Hermann Wilhelm Goering. On the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, death by hanging. Fritz Saukel.
The Nuremberg executions ended the lives of some of the most infamous Nazi leaders. But their story did not end there. What happened to their bodies was kept secret, fueling decades of rumors and speculation. Some believed they were hidden in unmarked graves, while others thought they vanished forever. The truth was far more surprising. In this video, we reveal what really happened after the executions and why the Allies made a decision that left a lasting mark on history. The untold story of what happened after the Nuremberg executions. The Nuremberg executions did not mark the final chapter for the Nazi leaders who were sentenced to death. In fact, what happened immediately afterward became one of the most secret and unusual military operations of the entire post-war period. The Allied forces understood that unaliving these men was only part of the mission. The bigger challenge was making sure their remains could never become symbols for those who still admired them. The concern was simple but serious. If men like Hermann Göring and the other condemned Nazi officials were placed in ordinary graves with their real names, dates, and identities, those locations could eventually become places of worship for extremists. A grave could become a shrine. A burial site could become a gathering place. The Allies had already seen how powerful symbols could be, and they refused to allow the remains of war criminals to become symbols of a movement they had fought to destroy. So the order was clear: remove every possible trace. Inside the same Nuremberg prison gymnasium where the executions had taken place, the bodies were carefully photographed and recorded. These images were not created for public display. They served as official proof that the men were truly dead. The Allies wanted to eliminate any possibility of rumors spreading that one of the most wanted Nazi leaders had escaped or survived in secret. After the photographs were taken, each body was placed in a plain wooden coffin with no markings or symbols of rank. Even Hermann Göring, who died by cyanide the night before his execution, was included. Once one of Nazi Germany's most powerful leaders, he was treated no differently than the others. Then came another unusual step. The bodies were assigned fake identities. Their real names disappeared from the records connected to the coffins, replaced by invented names belonging to fictional American soldiers. Göring himself was given the name George Munger. It was a strange and almost unbelievable contrast. A man who had once controlled armies, lived in luxury, and stood at the center of Nazi power was now reduced to a false name written on a plain coffin. No title, no military rank, no recognition, just an identity that never existed. On the morning of October 17, 1946, only one day after the executions, the operation moved into its next stage. 11 coffins were loaded onto the U.S. Army trucks under the watch of military police officers who had also guarded the Nuremberg trials. But there was one unusual detail. A 12th coffin was loaded onto the trucks, and it was completely empty. The reason for the extra coffin would become clear later. Before sunrise, the convoy quietly left the Palace of Justice and traveled more than 100 kilometers toward Munich. The destination was Ostfriedhof Cemetery, home to a crematorium that had been built years before the war. When the trucks arrived, the staff were given a carefully prepared explanation. They were told the coffins contained the remains of 12 American soldiers who had died during combat in 1945. According to the story, their bodies had been recovered later, and their families had requested cremation. It was a simple explanation, one that attracted little attention. 12 soldiers, 12 coffins, nothing unusual. But behind that ordinary story was a carefully planned military operation. As the cremations began, American soldiers surrounded the area. Armed guards remained nearby, and officers watched the entire process from beginning to end. This was not a normal funeral service. It was a secret mission carried out under the appearance of routine cemetery work. The process continued throughout the day. One by one, the bodies of the Nazi leaders were reduced to ashes. When the cremations were complete, the ashes were placed into urns marked with the same false identities that had been assigned to the coffins earlier that morning. The urns were then transported under military protection to a temporary U.S. Army morgue inside a private residence in Munich. But even then, the mission was not complete. The most difficult decision remained: what should happen to the ashes? The Allied authorities believed that even anonymous burial could create a future problem. A hidden grave might eventually be discovered. A secret location could become a destination for extremists searching for a place to honor the men they considered heroes. The final solution was even more extreme. Near the residence where the ashes were stored was the Wenzbach, a small stream connected to the Isar River in Munich. Later that same day, American soldiers carried the urns there and scattered the ashes into the moving water. But they did not stop there. To make certain that nothing remained behind, the soldiers destroyed the urns completely. The containers were smashed into pieces with axes and military boots, removing anything that could later be identified or preserved. When the operation ended, there was no grave to find, no memorial to visit, no remains that could be displayed, no physical location where supporters of Nazi ideology could gather and turn the dead into symbols. The goal was absolute disappearance. The Allied forces wanted the leaders of Nazi Germany to leave behind only history, not a place where hatred could be remembered, celebrated, or revived. What happened next after the bodies vanished from history forever? Keep watching to find out. Destroying the symbols left behind by the Nazi leaders. The disappearance of the Nazi leaders did not end with their bodies. After the executions, the U.S. Army faced another difficult question. What should happen to everything these men had left behind? Inside the prison cells of Nuremberg and the storage areas connected to the trial, there were countless personal belongings. Uniforms, medals, military decorations, letters, diaries, and other private items remained behind. To the Allies, these objects were more than simple possessions. They carried the power of symbols. A medal could represent military glory. A uniform could represent authority. A personal item could become something for supporters to preserve and celebrate. And that was exactly what American officials wanted to prevent. Before the Nuremberg trials had even ended, the uniforms worn by the accused men had already been stripped of their Nazi insignia and decorations. The items were carefully recorded and stored while officials decided what should happen next. In the end, there was no single solution. Each object was handled differently depending on who had owned it and what meaning it carried. One of the most interesting cases involved Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the former head of the German Armed Forces High Command. His military decorations were considered symbols of the power he had represented, so they were destroyed. His Knight's Cross, his Iron Cross medals from the First World War, and other awards were all eliminated. Even his Field Marshal's baton, a powerful symbol of the highest military authority in Nazi Germany, was destroyed. However, not everything connected to Keitel disappeared. 2 gold Nazi party badges from his collection survived. Before they were kept, the swastikas on them were scratched away. The badges were then transferred to the financial director of the American occupation zone in Germany, reportedly to be sold and used to help cover the expenses of carrying out the executions. It was a strange ending for objects that once represented Nazi power. The symbols of one of the regime's highest-ranking officers were reduced to simple pieces of valuable material used to help pay for the operation that ended his life. The same fate awaited General Alfred Jodl, the former chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces. Unlike Keitel, none of Jodl's medals or decorations were preserved. Every award connected to his military career was destroyed, leaving behind no official symbols of his former position. But when it came to Hermann Göring, the process became far more complicated. Göring had collected an enormous number of awards throughout his career. At the time of his capture, he possessed some of Germany's most prestigious military decorations, including the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, the Knight's Cross, and the famous Pour le Mérite from the First World War. also known as the Blue Max. These honors represented decades of military achievement and political power. But after the war, American authorities saw them differently. They were reminders of the man who had helped build and lead the Nazi war machine. So those decorations were destroyed, including his first-class Iron Cross from World War I. Yet some valuable items escaped destruction. Goering's solid gold Nazi party badge, his diamond-covered pilot observer badge, and other precious decorations were spared. Instead of being completely destroyed, the Nazi symbols were removed, and the items were sent away to be treated as valuable materials. The message was clear: the symbols would disappear, but the materials themselves still had value. Gold remained gold. Diamonds remained diamonds, even when they had once belonged to one of the most powerful figures in the Third Reich. Interestingly, Goering had owned multiple versions of many of his famous awards. Over the years, copies of his Blue Max, Grand Cross, and other medals were recovered from his personal possessions and private estate. Some were taken by soldiers, while others eventually entered private collections and museums. So while the U.S. Army attempted to erase the symbols connected to Goering's legacy, not everything vanished. Some pieces survived and continued to exist long after the man himself was gone. Another fascinating case involved Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Unlike the men who were executed, Dönitz survived the trials and received a 10-year prison sentence. As Hitler's chosen successor during the final days of Nazi Germany, he remained a major figure of the regime. One of his most valuable possessions was his diamond-studded U-boat war badge. After the trial, the badge was confiscated. The Nazi symbol was removed, and the piece was sent away as scrap jewelry, following the same process used for some of the valuable items belonging to the executed leaders. Beyond medals and decorations, the prisoners also left behind personal writings, letters to family members, private notes, diaries, and reflections about the trial were collected by American officials. These documents were organized and stored, but over time, many of them disappeared. Their exact fate remains uncertain. Some may have been lost, misplaced, or taken by individuals who had access to them after the war. The final stage of the cleanup involved clothing and remaining personal items. Any uniform that still carried visible Nazi symbols was burned. Ordinary clothing, less important belongings, and small personal items were returned to family members. The families also received whatever money the prisoners had left, although payments were limited to 1,000 German marks. Any remaining cash, along with valuable gemstones and precious items, was transferred to the financial authorities of the American Occupation Administration. By the end of the process, the Allies had removed not only the bodies of the Nazi leaders, but also many of the physical reminders of their power. The goal was not simply to end their lives. It was to prevent their possessions, symbols, and personal effects from becoming tools for creating a new movement built around their memory. But what exactly led these men to be put on trial? Stay tuned to find out. The trial that changed how the world punished war crimes. Before understanding what happened to the bodies and belongings of the Nazi leaders, it is important to understand why they were put on trial in the first place. The Nuremberg trials were not simply about punishing defeated enemies. They represented a turning point in how the world viewed justice, responsibility, and the actions of powerful leaders. After World War II, the Allied nations chose justice over revenge. They created the Nuremberg trials to prosecute the highest surviving Nazi leaders for planning aggressive wars, violating the laws of war, and committing what became known as crimes against humanity, establishing a historic legal precedent. This final category was especially significant because it introduced a new idea into international law, that leaders could be held personally responsible for the suffering and assassin of civilians, even when those crimes were carried out through the power of a government. The Nuremberg trials became a historic moment because they established that political leaders and military commanders were not above the law. Holding a position of power could no longer be used as a shield against responsibility. The trials were not perfect. They raised difficult questions about whether the victorious nations had the right to judge the defeated side and whether new legal standards could be applied after the crimes had already happened. Critics debated the idea of victor's justice, while others argued that the scale of Nazi crimes required an unprecedented response. But the Allies made a deliberate choice. Instead of simply executing enemies without explanation, they created a public record of what had happened. They collected evidence, heard testimony, and documented the actions of the Nazi regime for the entire world to see. The goal was not only punishment, it was accountability. The legacy of Nuremberg reached far beyond the courtroom. The trials helped shape modern international criminal law and influenced future efforts to prevent mass atrocities. They also contributed to the creation of the Genocide Convention, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. At the center of the first and most famous trial, known as the International Military Tribunal, were 24 of the most important surviving figures from Nazi Germany's political and military leadership. Among them was Hermann Göring, the powerful head of the Luftwaffe and the man Hitler had once named as his successor. There was also Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi Germany's foreign minister, who helped shape the regime's international policies. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, also stood before the court. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who led the armed forces' high command, was another major defendant. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a senior SS official who controlled the Reich's security main office, represented the brutal machinery of Nazi terror. Other defendants included Alfred Rosenberg, one of the regime's main ideological figures, Hans Frank, who controlled occupied Poland, and Wilhelm Frick, a key figure in Nazi government administration. Julius Streicher, the publisher of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, faced trial for spreading hateful propaganda. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was accused of using forced labor to support the Nazi war machine. Fritz Sauckel, who organized the forced labor system, was also among those charged. The list also included Karl Dönitz, the former commander of the German Navy, who briefly became Hitler's successor during the final days of the Third Reich. However, not every person originally named in the indictment appeared in the courtroom. Of the 24 defendants, 3 were missing when proceedings began. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful party secretary, was believed to have escaped, so he was tried in his absence. It was later discovered that he had actually died during the final battle for Berlin. Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, never reached trial because he took his own life before proceedings began. Meanwhile, industrial leader Gustav Krupp, head of the famous Krupp Company, was considered too mentally unfit to stand trial because of his declining health. The Nuremberg trials became more than a courtroom event. They were a message to the world that those who order destruction, create systems of oppression, and commit crimes against humanity can be held responsible. And after those historic judgments were delivered, the Allies faced another challenge, deciding what should happen to the men who had once represented the power of Nazi Germany. Why was this historic trial held in the city of Nuremberg? Let's find out. Why Nuremberg became the place where history judged the Nazis. The choice of Nuremberg as the location for the trials was not accidental. The city carried both practical importance and powerful symbolism. After the war, the Allies needed a place where the accused Nazi leaders could be safely held and where a major international trial could take place. Nuremberg offered exactly what they needed. The city's Palace of Justice had survived the destruction of the war with relatively little damage. It contained a large courtroom suitable for a trial of historic scale, and it was connected to a prison where the defendants could be securely kept during the proceedings. But the location meant much more than convenience. Before the war, Nuremberg had been one of the most important centers of Nazi propaganda. Every year, the city hosted massive Nazi party rallies where Adolf Hitler and his followers displayed their power in front of thousands of supporters. The famous rallies were designed to create an image of strength, unity, and absolute control. Now, the same city would become the place where that movement was put on trial. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The former stage of Nazi power became the courtroom where its leaders were forced to answer for their actions. Instead of allowing the city to remain only a reminder of Nazi influence, the Allies transformed it into a symbol of accountability. Holding the trial on German soil was also important. The message was clear. The crimes committed by the Nazi regime would not be judged in secrecy or from a distant location. They would be publicly examined in the country where they had been carried out. The Nuremberg trials were designed to show that even the most powerful governments and leaders could face judgment. However, the outcome of the trials has been debated for decades. With the overwhelming amount of evidence collected against the defendants, many people believed convictions were almost certain. Prosecutors presented thousands of documents, photographs, films, and witness testimonies that revealed the scale of Nazi crimes. The evidence was difficult to deny, but the legal process itself was something the world had never seen before. The idea of prosecuting leaders for crimes against humanity and aggressive war was still new. International law had never previously been used in such a way, creating questions about whether new legal standards were being applied after the events had already happened. Some critics argued that the trials created rules after the crimes had been committed. Others questioned whether a completely fair trial was possible when the nations that had defeated Germany were also acting as judges and prosecutors. These concerns created a difficult debate about justice, fairness, and the responsibility of victorious nations. Still, the idea that the trials were simply a guaranteed punishment is not completely accurate. Among the 22 defendants who were actually tried by the International Military Tribunal, 3 were found not guilty. The remaining defendants received different punishments, ranging from death sentences to lengthy prison terms. The judges did not treat every defendant the same, showing that the final decisions involved legal arguments and individual evaluations. The reality was more complicated. The world had already witnessed unimaginable crimes, and public opinion strongly demanded justice. Many believed that punishment was necessary, but reaching those verdicts still required years of investigation, careful preparation, legal battles, and opportunities for the accused to defend themselves. The Nuremberg trials were shaped by the weight of the evidence and the anger of a world recovering from war. Yet, they were not merely a planned performance with a predetermined ending. They were an attempt to create a new standard for justice, one where leaders could no longer hide behind their positions of power. And after the court delivered its final judgments, the world watched as the remaining symbols of Nazi authority began to disappear forever. Why did the Allies choose justice over quick revenge after the war? Keep watching to find out. Why the Allies chose trials instead of immediate execution. After the fall of Nazi Germany, many people believed there was only one possible punishment for the men responsible: immediate execution. The crimes committed by the Nazi regime were so enormous that some argued the leaders should face instant revenge rather than a lengthy legal process. But the Allied nations made a different choice. Instead of simply unaliving the surviving Nazi officials, they decided to put them on trial. It was a decision that required patience, planning, and a belief that justice had to be shown to the world. One of the strongest arguments for immediate punishment came from the desire to prevent Germany from ever rising again under the same ideology. During the Tehran Conference in 1943, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin reportedly suggested executing tens of thousands of leading Nazis to make sure Germany would never have the ability to start another war. However, the other Allied leaders rejected the idea of mass executions without trials. They understood that simply unaliving the defeated leaders could create a dangerous narrative. Future generations in Germany might claim that their leaders had been assassinated without being given a chance to defend themselves. The Nazis could portray themselves as victims rather than criminals. A public trial would remove that possibility. By presenting evidence in a courtroom, the Allies wanted the world to see exactly what the Nazi leadership had done. The crimes would not be based on rumors or accusations alone. They would be proven through documents, witness testimony, photographs, and official records. The second major reason was the importance of the rule of law. The Allies had spent years fighting a regime that ignored human rights and used violence as a tool of control. They wanted to show that their response would be different. Through the London Agreement and the charter that created the legal foundation for the trials, they promised that the accused would receive a proper legal process. The message was clear. The Allies were not seeking revenge. They were seeking justice. This distinction mattered. If the victorious nations had simply carried out mass executions, they risked becoming similar to the type of system they were trying to defeat. Punishment without trial could damage the moral authority the Allies claimed to represent. There were also political reasons behind the decision. After years of war, Europe needed to rebuild. Collective punishment or large-scale executions could create anger among the German population and make the difficult process of rebuilding the country even harder. The Allies understood that justice needed to be balanced with the future stability of Europe. Another important reason for holding the trials was documentation. The Nuremberg proceedings created an official record of Nazi crimes. The evidence presented in court, the witness statements, the photographs, and the final judgments preserved the truth for future generations. The world would not only hear that terrible crimes had happened, it would see the evidence and understand how those crimes were organized and carried out. The courtroom became a place where history was recorded. In the end, the Allies chose a slower and more difficult path. Instead of immediate revenge, they followed a process of investigation, trial, judgment, and punishment. Some defendants were sentenced to death, while others received prison terms or were acquitted. The goal was never to excuse what the Nazi leaders had done. The crimes remained among the worst in human history, and the punishments reflected that. But by choosing trials over executions, the Allies created something far more lasting than simple revenge. What happened when the world finally heard the Nuremberg verdicts? Keep watching to find out. The final judgments: who lived, who died, and who walked free. After months of testimony, evidence, and arguments from both sides, the International Military Tribunal finally reached its verdicts. The world waited to see what punishment would come for the men who had stood at the center of Nazi Germany's leadership. Of the 22 defendants who actually faced trial, 12 were sentenced to death. 7 received lengthy prison sentences, while 3 were found not guilty and released. Those 3 acquittals were important because they showed that the court was not simply created to punish every person placed in the defendant's seat. The judges did not automatically declare everyone guilty. They examined the evidence against each individual and reached different conclusions. Among those cleared was Hjalmar Schacht, a banker and economist who had played a major role in Germany's economic recovery after 1933. Although he had been connected to the Nazi government, the tribunal decided that the evidence was not enough to convict him of the charges he faced. Another acquitted defendant was Franz von Papen, a former German chancellor and diplomat. Papen had been part of the conservative political circle that helped bring Adolf Hitler into power, but the court determined that his involvement did not meet the legal standard required for conviction. Hans Fritzsche, a well-known radio broadcaster and former official in Nazi propaganda, was also found not guilty. Prosecutors argued that he helped spread Nazi messages, but the tribunal concluded that there was not enough evidence to prove his direct responsibility for the crimes charged. These acquittals became one of the strongest arguments that the Nuremberg trials were not simply a guaranteed punishment against every Nazi official. The court was willing to separate those who were proven guilty from those whose involvement did not reach the required level of responsibility. The timeline of the trial was also remarkable. The International Military Tribunal officially began on November 20, 1945, only months after the end of the war in Europe. The final verdicts were delivered almost a year later, between September 30th and October 1st, 1946. Considering the size and complexity of the case, the speed was extraordinary. The prosecutors had to collect and organize massive amounts of evidence from across Europe. They examined thousands of documents, questioned witnesses, presented photographs and films, and cross-examined the defendants themselves. There was also the enormous challenge of communication. Because the four Allied powers were involved, every courtroom session had to be translated into English, Russian, French, and German. Creating a system that allowed the trial to continue across multiple languages was itself a historic achievement. Despite these challenges, the tribunal moved forward and reached its conclusions in less than a year. Then came the final punishment. On October 16, 1946, the condemned Nazi leaders were executed. From the beginning of the trial to the final sentences being carried out, the entire process took roughly 1 year. For such a groundbreaking international legal case, involving some of the most serious crimes in history, that was an incredibly short period of time. So, what do you think about the truth concerning the Nuremberg execution bodies? Let us know in the comments section below. In the end, the story of the Nuremberg executions reveals how the Allies erased the final traces of Nazi power while creating a lasting lesson about justice and accountability. Like, subscribe, and join us for more untold stories.